As an F1 fan, nothing hurts more than watching your favorite team become a laughingstock. I've been there. We've all been there. But some seasons are so catastrophically bad they transcend normal disappointment and enter the realm of pure comedy. I'm talking about Ferrari finishing behind teams that don't exist anymore, McLaren engines being compared to junior formulas, and Williams forgetting to show up on time. These disasters shaped the sport we love today, and honestly, they're kind of hilarious in hindsight. Grab your popcorn because these nightmares force champions to change or die. And we're starting with the most shocking fall from grace in F1 history. Ferrari, 1980. When the prancing horse became a limping donkey. Ferrari in 1980 went from defending champions to finishing 10th in the Constructors' Championship with just 8 points. 8 bloody points. That's like Manchester United getting relegated to League Two while still wearing their trophy ribbons from the season before. The prancing horse didn't just stumble, it face-planted into the gravel and stayed there for the entire season. The 312 T5 was supposed to be an evolution of their championship-winning car, but it turned out to be a brick with wheels while everyone else discovered ground-effect aerodynamics. Ferrari's flat 12 boxer engine was wide and bulky, making it physically impossible to incorporate the new ground effect technology that rivals like Williams and Brabham were successfully using. You know when your grandparents refuse to upgrade from their flip phone because it still works perfectly fine? That was Ferrari clinging to their outdated engine design, while the rest of the grid embraced the future. Williams and Brabham were mastering this new era of downforce-heavy machinery that literally sucked themselves to the track for extra grip. Meanwhile, Ferrari's engineers were scratching their heads wondering why their car looked like it was driving through treacle. Here's the kicker: Jody Scheckter, the defending world champion, failed to qualify for the Canadian Grand Prix. The reigning champion couldn't even make it onto the starting grid. That's basically like Messi showing up to the World Cup and not making it past the group stage. The humiliation was complete. To put this disaster in perspective, Williams, the eventual Constructors' champion that year, finished a massive 112 points ahead of Ferrari. That's not just losing, that's getting obliterated by teams that were supposed to be fighting for scraps. Ferrari's engineers watched helplessly as their outdated brick got lapped by cars that looked like they came from the future. The ground effect cars were sleek, low, and fast. The Ferrari looked like someone had forgotten to tell it that aerodynamics had evolved beyond make it red and hope for the best. Reliability vanished faster than free pizza at a university event. Ferrari drivers spent more time parked on track than actually racing, which defeats the entire point of motorsport. Every mechanical failure felt like another nail in the coffin of their reputation. By season's end, Ferrari's fall was so public and painful it became a masterclass in how even legends can be humiliated when technology moves on without them. This disaster forced Ferrari to completely rethink their approach, proving that sometimes you need to hit rock bottom before you can climb back up. But Ferrari's nightmare was just the beginning. Sometimes the most painful disasters come from reunions that should have been magical. McLaren 2015, the Honda reunion from hell. McLaren and Honda's reunion was supposed to recreate the magic of the Senna era, but instead became F1's most expensive dumpster fire. The hype was unreal, two legendary names coming together to conquer the sport again. Instead, they created a masterpiece of disappointment that made grown men cry and accountants question their career choices. The RA615H power unit was so underpowered and unreliable that McLaren scored just 27 points all season and finished 9th in the Constructors' Championship. 27. That's fewer than some drivers get in 3 good races, and McLaren had 2 world champions behind the wheel for an entire season. The engine had a significant straight-line speed deficit, often estimated around 80 to 100 horsepower at times, which is like showing up to a drag race with a bicycle. Fernando Alonso's infamous radio rant became the soundtrack to McLaren's misery. GP2 engine, GP2 engine, he screamed over the radio, comparing their power unit to a feeder series. That clip went viral for all the wrong reasons, becoming the perfect summary of Honda's return to F1. You could hear the soul leaving his body through the radio static. The car's size 0 engine packaging sounded brilliant in theory, but in practice meant they built a beautiful chassis around a potato. The concept forced Honda's RA615H engine to operate at excessively high temperatures, immediately causing ERS and reliability issues that forced the team to run the engine heavily detuned during early races just to finish. The engineers got so focused on making everything compact and aerodynamically perfect that they forgot the engine actually needed to work without melting itself. Jenson Button and Alonso spent more time fighting mechanical failures than fighting for positions, turning two world champions into mobile chicanes. These guys had won races, won championships, and now they were basically rolling roadblocks that other drivers overtook like they were standing still. The straight-line speed deficit was so brutal that McLaren drivers were getting passed by cars they should have been lapping. Honda's return was meant to showcase Japanese engineering excellence, but instead showcased how to make a Mercedes engine look like a rocket ship. Every weekend became a painful reminder that Honda had forgotten how to build competitive F1 power units. The reliability was shocking, the power was pathetic, and the excuses were endless. The season turned a storied partnership into a cautionary tale about overambition without execution, proving that nostalgia doesn't win races. McLaren's fall from grace was complete, from championship contenders to backmarkers faster than you could say engine penalty. But even McLaren's disaster looked organized compared to what happened when a legendary team couldn't even get their car ready for the season. Williams, 2019. From heroes to zeros in record time. Williams arrived late to testing with an unfinished car, which is like showing up to an exam without studying and forgetting to bring a pen. The FW42 wasn't ready for the opening days of preseason testing, forcing them to miss the first 2.5 days of crucial track time while their competitors were already fine-tuning their setups. Claire Williams called it embarrassing, which is corporate speak for "we absolutely fucked this up." When the car finally hit the track, it was described as unfinished and unrefined. Not exactly the words you want associated with your Formula One car. The FW42 was 2 seconds off the pace in some testing sessions, turning George Russell and Robert Kubica into mobile advertisements for how not to build an F1 car. 2 seconds might not sound like much, but in Formula One terms, that's like being lapped while everyone else is still on the formation lap. Scoring just 1 point across 21 races, Williams went from the team that gave us Nigel Mansell and Ayrton Senna to the team that barely showed up on time. That single point came from Robert Kubica at the chaotic German Grand Prix, achieved only after a rain-soaked disaster that saw 7 cars fail to finish and penalties applied to both Alfa Romeo drivers. Williams transformed from championship winners to backmarkers who couldn't even get their car ready for the season start. During qualifying sessions, Russell's car was consistently nearly 2 seconds slower than the next slowest competitor, putting Williams in their own uncompetitive league. The kid was clearly quick, but even Lewis Hamilton couldn't have made that car competitive. Russell was hampered by machinery that some observers called borderline undrivable, forcing him to extract performance that simply didn't exist. Every race weekend became an exercise in damage limitation rather than genuine competition, turning proud racers into reluctant participants. The team that once dominated F1 with technological innovation was now struggling with basic reliability and competitiveness. Race weekends felt like watching a once great athlete struggle through their final, painful years, except the athlete was an entire F1 team. The aerodynamic concept was flawed, funding was severely restricted, and team morale was shattered. This nadir forced Williams to completely restructure their entire operation, eventually leading to their sale and proving that even giants can crumble when everything goes wrong at once. Williams had become the cautionary tale every F1 team fears becoming. But sometimes the most painful disasters come from teams with unlimited resources who still manage to achieve absolutely nothing. Mercedes 2011. The future dynasty's growing pains. Mercedes in 2011 had 0 podiums across 19 races, despite having a budget that could fund several small countries. 0. Not a single top 3 finish across an entire season, which is like hiring Gordon Ramsay to cook dinner and getting burnt toast every single night. The silver arrows looked more like silver snails as they crawled around circuits that should have been their hunting grounds. The W02 looked premium and sounded expensive, but performed like a luxury car trying to compete in a rally. Pretty but pointless. Mercedes had thrown serious money at this project, hired top engineers, and built facilities that looked like NASA headquarters. But all that investment produced a car that struggled to finish in the points, let alone challenge for victories. Michael Schumacher's comeback was meant to be triumphant, but instead became a demonstration of how far the team had to go. The seven-time world champion found himself battling Force Indias and Saubers instead of challenging Red Bulls and McLarens. His best result came in Canada, where he briefly ran second before faster cars using DRS quickly passed him, showing that even when the W02 had a moment of promise, it couldn't sustain performance against proper machinery. Watching Schumacher fight midfield battles instead of championship fights was like watching Mozart play kazoo in a subway station. Technically proficient but absolutely wrong for the setting. Despite all that Daimler money and factory resources, the W02 suffered from fundamentally underdeveloped aerodynamics compared to Red Bull's advanced designs and catastrophic tire degradation on long runs that killed any race pace. Mercedes engineers were essentially playing whack-a-mole with problems, fixing one issue only to discover three more hiding underneath. The car couldn't generate proper downforce, couldn't manage tire temperatures, and couldn't find pace anywhere on the circuit. Team meetings must have been awkward, as engineers tried to explain why their expensive car was slower than teams with half their budget. How do you tell Daimler executives that your multi-million-dollar investment is getting embarrassed by privateers running on shoestring budgets? The season became a harsh lesson in humility for a manufacturer used to dominating other racing series. Every race weekend reinforced that Mercedes still had years of development ahead before they could challenge for wins. The gap to the front wasn't measured in tenths of seconds, but entire seconds, which in Formula One terms represents years of development work. The W02 wasn't just slow, it was fundamentally flawed. This universally painful transition year forced Mercedes to completely rethink their entire management and engineering structure before they could launch their subsequent dynasty. The 2011 disaster became the internal turning point that taught them what success actually required. But sometimes even successful teams can spectacularly implode when partnerships turn toxic and public feuds replace professional collaboration. Red Bull 2015, when the Bulls lost their wings. Red Bull's 2015 season turned the paddock into a battlefield as Helmut Marko and Christian Horner publicly roasted Renault like it was a medieval execution. The team that had dominated Formula One for 4 straight years was suddenly slower than a shopping trolley with a wonky wheel, and they weren't keeping quiet about whose fault it was. The RB11 chassis was actually decent. Adrian Newey had done his usual magic with the aerodynamics and packaging. But the Renault power unit made it about as competitive as bringing a bicycle to a motorcycle race. The straight-line speed deficit was brutal, turning Daniel Ricciardo and Daniel Kvyat into mobile chicanes that faster cars overtook like they were standing still. Horner's complaining reached legendary levels, turning press conferences into therapy sessions where he vented about Renault's shortcomings. The man could find 17 different ways to say the engine was garbage without actually saying the word garbage. Every media session became must-watch television as journalists waited to see what creative metaphor Horner would use to describe their power unit problems. Let me know in the comments what your favorite Horner complaint moment was. The man was basically Shakespeare when it came to creative engine criticism. The public feud between Red Bull and Renault was so intense it made divorced couples look amicable by comparison. Marko delivered cutting remarks about Renault needing to do the job properly or not at all, while Horner complained about their lack of patience with underperformance. The situation got so toxic that Red Bull threatened to quit Formula One entirely if the engine performance problems continued, turning their frustration into an ultimatum that shocked the entire paddock. Power unit reliability was catastrophic, with DNFs piling up throughout the season, though Red Bull still managed to salvage 4th in the Constructors' Championship despite the constant mechanical failures. Every weekend brought fresh breakdowns, turning race preparation into damage limitation exercises. The team that had won 4 consecutive championships was suddenly fighting for scraps in the midfield like a dethroned king begging for coins. Renault's engineers probably needed therapy after the constant public humiliation from their supposedly partner team. Red Bull wasn't just criticizing performance behind closed doors, they were broadcasting their frustration to the entire world through press conferences and interviews. The partnership had become toxic, faster than milk left in the sun. Red Bull's frustration was understandable, but their approach was like setting your own house on fire to prove your neighbor's garden looks messy. The public warfare damaged relationships throughout the paddock and made finding alternative engine suppliers nearly impossible when Mercedes and Ferrari refused to help. The season became famous for its soap opera drama as much as its on-track struggles, proving that even dynasties can unravel spectacularly. This toxic relationship eventually forced both sides to reevaluate their partnership, though the damage was already done. But sometimes the most painful lesson comes from watching a manufacturer try to prove they could do better on their own. Renault 2016, proving they could disappoint as Works Team 2. Renault's return as a Works team in 2016 was supposed to mark their renaissance, but instead proved they could disappoint in multiple roles. After years of supplying engines to other teams and watching them struggle, Renault thought they'd show everyone how it's done. Spoiler alert, they couldn't. The RS16 was rushed into existence like a university assignment written the night before deadline, and it showed in every painful lap. Renault had taken over the struggling Lotus team so late in 2015 that they had to rush the chassis development and completely redesign parts of the car originally intended to use Mercedes engines to fit the Renault power unit. They inherited a mess and somehow managed to make it messier. Julian Palmer and Kevin Magnussen managed just 8 points from 21 races, which is like a restaurant getting 8 customers all year and wondering why they're going bankrupt. Palmer scored his first F1 point in Malaysia, while Magnussen's best finish was 7th in Russia. That was literally the highlight of their entire season. The car struggled to generate pace, downforce, and reliability, basically everything you need to go fast around a racetrack. The RS16 was slow in the corners, slow on the straights, and unreliable everywhere else. Renault had mastered the art of being comprehensively terrible across all areas of performance. Renault inherited a Lotus-era platform and somehow made it worse, which takes genuine talent in reverse engineering. They took a car that was already struggling and turned it into something that made the original look competitive. The yellow livery looked fresh and optimistic, but the on-track reality was more like watching paint dry in slow motion. By mid-season, Renault shifted most resources to 2017, with minimal RS16 development thereafter. Team meetings must have been depressing as engineers tried to explain why their works effort was slower than their customer teams. Red Bull was using Renault engines and still finishing ahead of the actual Renault team, which is like being outsold by your own knockoff products. The RS16 highlighted how difficult it is to reintegrate a manufacturer into modern F1's arms race between chassis and engine development. Building competitive engines is hard enough, but building competitive cars requires entirely different expertise that Renault had to relearn from scratch. Finishing 9th in the Constructors' Championship meant those 8 points made 2016 their worst performance as a Works Formula One constructor since the 1978 season, emphasizing the depth of their failure despite returning as a manufacturer outfit. They finished ahead of only Manor and Sauber, which is like winning a participation trophy at a spelling bee. This transitional nightmare laid the groundwork for future improvements, though 2016 will always be remembered as Renault's cautionary comeback chapter. But even Renault's financial stability looked rock solid compared to teams that turned racing into a constant battle against bankruptcy lawyers. Spyker 2007, more famous for bankruptcy than racing. Spyker's 2007 F1 campaign was like a financial thriller with an orange livery and a really disappointing ending. The team's very survival hung by a thread, making each race feel like a desperate plea for continued existence rather than actual competition. Every weekend became a question of whether they'd make it to the next one. The team scored one solitary constructors' point all season, which is like a football team scoring one goal all year and calling it progress. That single point came courtesy of a fluke finish when half the field retired, proving that sometimes even terrible teams get lucky. The name change sequence from Spyker MF. One Racing to the standalone Spyker F1. Team in 2007 solidified the continuous financial instability and ownership turmoil that would plague this lineage for years. The Spyker F87 was slow, overweight, and unreliable. Basically everything you don't want in a racing machine except good-looking. The car stemmed from the once successful Jordan Grand Prix lineage, but had devolved into something painfully slow and aerodynamically obsolete. It was like watching a thoroughbred racehorse turn into a cart horse over the span of a few years. The season was defined by financial instability that made the team's future more uncertain than a weather forecast. The desperation for cash over talent became brutally clear when Christian Albers lost his seat mid-season simply because his sponsorship money dried up, leaving Adrian Seudel to carry the team's hopes alone. Spyker was essentially racing while bankruptcy lawyers circled like vultures, turning every race weekend into a potential farewell tour. The team's orange livery was probably the most memorable thing about their entire F1 existence, which says everything about their competitiveness. You could spot that bright orange car from miles away, mainly because it was usually at the back of the field going significantly slower than everyone else. The car looked distinctive but performed terribly. Drivers spent more time worrying about getting paid than getting points, which is not exactly conducive to peak performance. Team meetings probably involved more accountants than engineers, turning a racing team into a financial rescue operation. Instead of discussing aerodynamics and setup changes, they were probably calculating how many races they could afford before running out of money completely. The Jordan lineage had been reduced to scraping by on sponsorship deals and prayers, a far cry from their more successful past. Spyker's legacy became proof that passion alone can't pay the bills or make cars go fast. The team eventually transformed into Force India, but 2007 will always be remembered as their rock-bottom year when survival mattered more than speed. But at least Spyker was trying to compete with limited resources. Some teams had all the money in the world and still managed to achieve absolutely nothing by simply giving up entirely. Haas 2021, the gap year that never ended. Haas treated 2021 like a gap year, except gap years are supposed to be educational, and this was just depressing. The team basically gave up before the season even started, deciding to focus all their resources on the 2022 regulation changes instead of actually trying to be competitive. The VF21 was essentially a modified version of their previous year's car with minimal upgrades, which is like showing up to a knife fight with a butter knife you borrowed from last year's picnic. Scoring 0 points all season with Mick Schumacher and Nikita Mazepin was like watching a masterclass in how not to develop young talent. 0 points across 21 races is genuinely impressive in all the wrong ways. These two rookies were thrown into cars that couldn't compete with anyone, turning what should have been a learning experience into a public humiliation tour. Haas essentially gave up on competitiveness to focus on 2022, which is like skipping an entire school year to prepare for the next one. The team's approach to development was basically non-existent, making them mobile chicanes rather than genuine competitors. They made no significant upgrades throughout the season, accepting their role as rolling obstacles for faster cars to navigate around. Schumacher showed flashes of potential, but was hampered by a car that seemed designed to finish last in every session. The kid had talent, but was driving machinery that made him look amateur, which is unfair to any developing driver. Meanwhile, Mazepin's presence added controversy without performance, turning the team into a lightning rod for criticism about pay drivers and sporting integrity. Fans nicknamed Mazepin Mazespin after his frequent spins, which tells you everything about how that went. Haas ran effectively undeveloped hardware all year and made no meaningful in-season upgrades, confirming their intentional choice to abandon the 2021 campaign for 2022 preparation. Every race weekend became an exercise in simply showing up rather than actually competing, which defeats the point of motorsport. Team principal Guenther Steiner's repeated statements that the team was where we are reflected a resigned attitude that suggested they'd already given up fighting. The season reinforced perceptions that Haas had sacrificed sporting integrity for financial convenience, which is never a good look in Formula One. This gap-year approach proved that in F1, you can't just phone it in for a season and expect fans or competitors to respect the effort. Haas finished dead last in the Constructors' Championship, proving that treating an entire season as practice for next year doesn't actually work. But sometimes the most painful disasters come from teams that had tasted genuine success, only to watch it evaporate completely. Toro Rosso, 2009, when lightning refused to strike twice. Toro Rosso's 2009 season proved that Sebastian Vettel's 2008 Monza miracle was lightning in a bottle, and bottles don't get struck twice. The team went from shock race winners to absolute backmarkers faster than you could say new aerodynamic regulations. One year, they're celebrating their first and only victory with champagne and tears. The next year, they're struggling to adapt to rules that completely reshuffled the competitive order. The STR4 went from competitive machinery to mobile roadblock status thanks to regulation changes that hit them like a freight train. The 2009 Aero rules completely reshuffled the grid, and Toro Rosso discovered they had absolutely no idea how to adapt. While their senior Red Bull team figured out the new regulations and became championship contenders with the RB5, Toro Rosso was left behind like a tourist trying to keep up with marathon runners. The driver lineup changed from Vettel and Sebastian Bourdais to a rotation of hopefuls who quickly discovered the car was completely hopeless. These new guys probably watched footage of Vettel winning at Monza and wondered if they were driving the same car, because the STR4 felt like it came from a different century entirely. Scoring just 8 points all season after winning a race the year before was like going from lottery winner to bankruptcy in 12 months. 8 points across an entire season is genuinely pathetic for any team, but for the defending race winners, it was absolutely brutal. The team finished 10th in the Constructors' Championship, which is basically last place with extra embarrassment. The STR4 was built around aerodynamic concepts borrowed from Red Bull's design philosophy, but used Ferrari's 2009 engine and struggled to adapt to the new aero regulations, including double diffusers, creating a package that combined confused development with inadequate adaptation to rule changes. Toro Rosso discovered that success built on hand. Me-down designs doesn't guarantee future competitiveness when the regulations change completely. Every race weekend became a painful reminder that their 2008 glory was increasingly looking like a beautiful accident rather than genuine pace. The contrast between Monza's euphoria and 2009's struggle was so stark, it felt like watching two different sports entirely. One minute they're celebrating their greatest triumph, the next they're struggling to qualify competitively. The team's fall highlighted how quickly F1 fortunes can change when regulations shift and development goes catastrophically wrong. Toro Rosso proved that lightning definitely doesn't strike twice, especially when your entire competitive package was based on borrowed designs and lucky circumstances. This harsh lesson proved that in F1, yesterday's heroes can become today's footnotes faster than a pit stop gone wrong. Those 8 points left them dead, last in the 2009 Constructors' Championship, definitively cementing their fall from the 2008 win. But at least Toro Rosso had tasted victory before their collapse. Some teams managed to achieve complete irrelevance without ever experiencing success at all. Sauber 2014, the team that gave us nothing. Sauber's 2014 season was a masterclass in how to score 0 points while maintaining the illusion of being a professional racing team. 0 points across an entire season is genuinely impressive in all the wrong ways. The C33 became the first car in Sauber's history to register absolutely nothing on the scoreboard, which is like a restaurant serving customers for an entire year and never getting a single positive review. The C33 became the emblem of lost identity. The team that discovered Kimi Räikkönen suddenly couldn't discover the points zone. This was the same outfit that had nurtured future champions and occasionally grabbed podiums when everything aligned perfectly. Now they couldn't even sniff the top 10 on their best days, turning a respected midfield operation into a rolling joke. Weight issues and an uncompetitive Ferrari engine package left Esteban Gutierrez and Adrian Sutil fighting for pride rather than positions. Drivers resorted to aggressive weight cuts to offset an overweight C33, in a futile attempt to bring the fundamentally overweight car closer to the minimum mandatory weight limit. The car was overweight, underpowered, and aerodynamically challenged, which is basically every problem you can have in Formula One rolled into one depressing package. Financial vulnerability forced personnel changes that turned the team into a revolving door of desperation. Staff departures became routine as the organization struggled to maintain stability while hemorrhaging money and credibility simultaneously. The 0-point season felt like watching a once proud football club get relegated to amateur leagues while their best players jumped ship. Every race weekend reinforced that Sauber had lost not just pace, but their entire competitive identity. They weren't just slow, they were irrelevant. Team meetings probably involved more crisis management than race strategy, which is never a good sign when you're supposed to be racing cars professionally. The season became a stark symbol of how quickly F1 teams can fall from relevance to irrelevance. Sauber had been a fixture in Formula One's midfield battles for years, occasionally threatening the bigger teams and always providing solid competition. The C33 destroyed that reputation in a single season, proving that respectability takes years to build but can disappear overnight. This identity crisis forced Sauber to completely reevaluate their approach, though the damage to their reputation was already done. The team that once represented Swiss precision and reliability had become synonymous with failure and disappointment. But at least Sauber's problems were purely competitive. Some teams managed to combine 0 points with complete organizational chaos that made their on-track struggles look like the least of their problems. Midland 2006. More owners than points. Midland's 2006 season featured more ownership changes than a second-hand car dealership and about as much success. The team went through more rebrands than a failed startup trying to find its identity, which is never a good sign when you're supposed to be racing cars professionally. They started as Midland F1 Racing for most of the season, then became Spyker MF1 Racing for the final 3 races after Spyker Cars bought them for $106.6 million in September, like they were having an identity crisis mid-season. Originally purchased from Jordan Grand Prix and intended to be Russia's first Formula One team, they managed to create more confusion than patriotic pride. The constant ownership speculation made it impossible for fans to keep track of what they were actually called or who was running the show from one race to the next. Scoring 0 points while shuffling through multiple leadership changes proved that instability at the top guarantees disaster on track. 0 points across an entire season is genuinely impressive in all the wrong ways, especially when your car wasn't even the slowest thing on the grid. The team finished 10th in the Constructors' Championship, which sounds respectable until you realize they were only ahead of Super Aguri, relying on other backmarkers failing to score points for the entirety of the season to secure the position. The constant ownership turmoil made the team's future more uncertain than a coin flip in a hurricane. Every few months brought new ownership speculation, making it impossible for anyone to plan beyond the next race weekend. Staff probably updated their CVS more often than they updated the car's aerodynamics package. Even when progress crept in on aerodynamics and tire management, the on-track results remained stubbornly terrible. The team's best qualifying performance was 14th, which is like celebrating finishing last at a spelling bee because you spelled your name correctly. Toyota customer engines provided decent power, but the chassis couldn't translate that into competitive lap times. Midland's 2006 campaign became a masterclass in how not to structure a modern Formula One constructor. The team's revolving door of management made it impossible to maintain any consistent development direction. Every race weekend felt like watching a company in administration pretend to be a racing team while accountants counted pennies in the background. The season proved that in Formula One, you can't race competitively while simultaneously fighting for survival off track. Midland's ultimate fate became a cautionary tale about the importance of stable ownership and clear vision in motorsport's most demanding series, eventually transforming into Force India after this painful transitional period. But Midland's organizational chaos was just one example of how quickly things can go wrong in this sport. These disasters prove that in Formula One, nobody's safe from spectacular failure. Ferrari with decades of history, Haas with a fraction of the budget, you're equally capable of becoming a laughingstock when everything goes wrong. The beautiful irony is that these nightmare seasons often force teams to evolve or die, with many using rock bottom as a launching pad for future success. These legendary failures live forever in memes and YouTube compilations, proving that sometimes being memorably bad is better than being forgettably mediocre. At least we remember their disasters more than some teams' entire existence.